Welcome, everybody. It is Monday. Welcome to RfRx, your prescription for coping. My name is Helen, our wonderful hostess with the mostest. Kara is off tonight. They are under the weather, so you get me and my wonderful co-host Rob. Say hi, Rob.
Hello, glad to be here. I'm not happy that Carr is not here, but I am happy to co-host with you.
I know. I'm happy to close with you. That's like the one upside that when Kara is not feeling well, that you and I get to host together. So that's always fun. So it's even better when all three of us do it together. That's also a lot of fun.
That was neat.
Yeah. So anyway, now that I went through all of that, Rob, what's tonight's topic?
Yes, well, we have a fascinating topic tonight. This week we'll be talking about mythicism, not mysticism, mythicism. It's an often misunderstood and mispronounced position. The talk tonight will dive into an alternate explanation for Christian origins that do not involve Jesus as a real historical figure. Minimal mythicism takes on the burden of proof to not only provide this alternative explanation and evidence supporting it, but also to explain existing evidence surrounding Christian history. Many Christians and atheists alike have questions regarding the origins of Christianity and about Jesus. For example, why does the Bible say Jesus was from two different places? Why isn't there physical evidence for Jesus? And should there be?
So John Gleason, known as the Godless Engineer, is an ex-Christian who has worked to build an online community of secular skeptics that analyze apologists or exclusionists by Brian Keith Dalton, also known as Mr. Deity, claims to give people the best information available so they can stand up and use their voices. He focuses on the intersection of atheism, secularism, religion, politics, history, and science. He is currently creating videos and social media content to educate his audience on these topics on his YouTube channel, Godless Engineer. And I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat while John comes on and starts his talk. Hi, John.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me, everybody. I'm really excited to talk about this particular topic. I have a presentation that I'm going to be going through, but feel free to ask questions during the presentation as I'm talking. If something doesn't sound right and you want to dive a little bit more into it, because this is just going to kind of be an overview of the mythicism topic. So this is not going to be anything that is in depth, like as far as like going extremely in depth into the actual like scholarship behind a lot of the points, but we will be mentioning scholarship at times when it's important. So this should be easy to understand and maybe clear up some misconceptions that a lot of people have about the position in general.
So, John, have you tackled this on your channel?
Yeah, extensively for the past 10 years, 12 years, or about the past 12 years.
So this is a big topic of interest for you. Okay, great.
Yeah. So just so we can clarify, what is the mythicism versus mythicism? Like what is the difference?
Well, so the minimal mythicism that I'm advocating for tonight is specifically about Jesus. It's Jesus mythicism is another way that people have labeled it or described it. And that's simply the belief that the Christian religion didn't need a historical figure in Jesus in order to begin or to originate, and that there's actual substantial amount of evidence to show that the first Christians probably viewed Jesus as a purely celestial divine being that accomplished all of the things that he supposedly accomplished in the heavens in a more celestial realm, which is quite different in first century Jewish theology. A lot of people mistake the celestial realm for being some kind of like alternative dimension or like a spiritual plane that doesn't exist corporeally, congruent with like the earth and the surface of the earth. In fact, the Jews, these early Jews, they had this idea that the celestial plane was actually someplace where you could get to, which, that's the Leaning Tower, or not Leaning Tower, sorry, the Tower of Babel, You know, they were trying to build up this giant structure so that they could get to heaven with, you know, and everything, because they thought that there was a firmament. And that's how, you know, they thought of the sort of the cosmos. You know, they thought that the celestial heavens were divided up into at least 7 different levels of heaven, and the lowest part of heaven was actually the firmament, which would have been right above like what they perceived to be like the sky. And so that's an important aspect to Jewish theology that a lot of people don't really reconfigure their minds about whenever they're discussing what the Jews believed and what they would have believed.
Okay.
All right, so
Thank you for clarifying. That's helpful. So anyway, so go ahead. Sorry, I'll shut up.
no, you're fine. You're fine. Like I said, if anybody has any questions as I go through my presentation here, feel free to ask me. I can quickly switch back to my regular camera so you don't have to look at my tiny face on the screen. But here, just the cover right here, obviously. All right, so first I want to heavily emphasize that I am not a scholar, but my information today is supported by relevant experts in the field of history and New Testament studies. Currently, the full peer-reviewed hypothesis of minimal mythicism is described by Richard Carrier's on the historicity of Jesus. Raphael Lataster's questioning the historicity of Jesus also establishes a good foundation for remaining agnostic on the topic, while at the same time responding to the best historical defense that currently exists. He does a deep dive on both Dr. Bart Ehrman's Did Jesus Exist and Maurice Casey's attempt to prove that Jesus existed, although Carrier's book is a little bit more accessible in that it's got a much cheaper price tag, whereas questioning the historicity of Jesus is geared towards like college level libraries. So that one's actually quite expensive. Although I do have a copy of it. It was very much a Christmas present. Both works contain extensive footnotes and citations establishing that they are consulting the full range of academic sources to establish their positions, and I highly recommend either book. So, first off, what exactly is mythicism that we've sort of covered here? Mythicism is a historical hypothesis concerning the existence of Jesus. Historical hypotheses are usually judged on the basis of how likely something did exist or occur in the past. That's why I'm specific in describing my conclusion. I usually say that Jesus probably didn't exist because it is a likelihood calculation. Minimal mythicism stipulates that he was originally a celestial figure that was given a body constructed by God using David's seed. He subsequently descended from the upper heavens to the lower heavens in the firmament just above the earth. While there, he is killed, buried, and resurrected. He then ascended back up into the upper heavens, therefore defeating death. Later, he appeared to people on earth, proclaiming his sacrifice and offering eternal salvation from their sins. There is a lot of evidential support for this hypothesis, and given the context of Christianity, it is the best explanation for the weird evidence that we find in sources like Paul, which we will be covering tonight, which means it seems to be the most parsimonious explanation for what we find in early Christianity. Now, why Jesus probably never existed. This is what I'm going to talk about. We're going to be discussing the background information to Christianity. We're going to discuss the Pauline evidence. And then finally, we're going to cover the extra biblical references to this Jesus. And again, I want to emphasize, if you don't understand something or you want me to expound upon something, feel free to just make me stop and I can answer your question to the best of my ability. All right. So let's start before the rise of Christianity. If you want a thorough explanation of what I'm about to go over, of course, read on the historicity of Jesus or Questioning the Historicity of Jesus. Since Christianity originally started as a Jewish sect, it's important to understand that there was no standard set of Jewish beliefs. There was a vast landscape of different sects that existed in the first century. Their ideas about their religion differed wildly at times, and this is supported by a number of scholars like Carrier, James Charles Worth, Peter Pokemy. Sorry, I'm bad at pronouncing names. J. Andrew Overman, Robert McLennan, Margaret Williams, Morton Smith, Alan Siegel, Hames, Charles Worth. One example of these groups would be the Essenes, as revealed by the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes rejected the temple and understood the laws of Moses in completely different ways than the rest of Judaism. This establishes that there were Jews that weren't necessarily holding to traditional Jewish beliefs, but were branching out and changing what they believed while remaining Jewish. This is the exact environment Christianity would develop in. It allows for non-traditional and varied ideas to be easily accepted by the Jewish community. Through Philo of Alexandria, we also know that there was a syncretization going on between Hellenistic ideas and the Jewish religion. Syncretism between Hellenistic ideas and other religious beliefs was a trend at this time and place in history. Mithraism was a combination of Hellenistic and Persian ideas. The mysteries of Attis and Cybele was a syncretization of Hellenistic and Anatolian ideas. The mysteries of Isis and Osiris was a syncretization between Egyptian and Hellenistic ideas. During this time of syncretization, Philo describes the Logos of God. This Logos is described by Philo to be the firstborn Son of God, the celestial image of God, God's agent of creation, and God's celestial high priest. He connects this Logos to an already existing archangel figure in Jewish angelology. He cites Zechariah 6:12 as a reference to this archangel, establishing that one of his names that you could make a coherent argument, a strong argument for, is Yeshua, or Jesus, as we come to know him in the Gospels. In this section, Philo literally says that it makes no sense to describe the high priest in Zechariah the way that Zechariah does. But if you reinterpret this verse as discussing this incorporeal firstborn son of God and celestial high priest, then it makes perfect sense. This doesn't mean that anyone worshiped this angel, but there was a pre-existent belief eerily similar to Paul's Jesus Christ. So Philo establishes that there was an effort by some Jews who were researching the scriptures for an indication of who and what this Messiah/Redeemer figure was supposed to be. This process is known as Pesherim creation. We know Philo practiced this by not only this section discussing the archangel, but multiple sections across Philo's work where he cites specific passages and provides alternative interpretations for what God meant by those passages. Philo even goes as far as to specifically praise the practice of Pesher creation. Continuing with Philo, he also establishes a weird belief about Moses. He thought Moses was a pre-existing divine figure. He considered Moses to have been given a body by God to use when he descended down to earth to rule as king. Then he was exalted and ascended back up into heaven. Dr. Bart Ehrman says this in How Jesus Became God. At times, Philo goes even further and imagines Moses as a kind of pre-existent divine being sent to earth for a time. And even when God sent him as a loan to the earthly sphere and caused him to dwell there, he fitted him with no ordinary excellence, such as that which kings and rulers have. But he appointed him as God, placing all the bodily region and the mind which rules it in subjugation and slavery to him. This is in Sacrifices 8 through 10. And he says, like other specially favored humans who had particularly close relationships with God, so close that Moses himself could be considered in some sense divine. At the end of his life, Moses was highly exalted by God and made immortal. When he was about to depart from hence to heaven to take up his abode there, and leaving this mortal life to become immortal, having been summoned by the Father, who now changed him, having previously been a double being composed of soul and body, into the nature of a single body, transforming him wholly and entirely into a most son-like mind. That's in Life of Moses 2:28. What this establishes is that this basic premise of minimal mythicism isn't weird in Judaism. They were considering some divine beings as being given bodies to accomplish things and then ascend back up into heaven. Augmenting this concept to fit Jesus in minimal mythicism compared to how most people are talking about minimal. Sorry, that was a malformed sentence there. We also have pre-Christian Jewish traditions contained in the Talmud. These traditions would include an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as speaking about the Messiah, a dying and rising Christ, son of Joseph, quoting Zechariah 12:10, and this Christ figure would be, quote, pierced to death. While the Talmud dates between the 4th and 6th century CE, the Jews wouldn't invent a Christ with a father named Joseph who dies and is resurrected to be man's redeemer of sins after Christianity arose. This would only validate what the Christians were already espousing. If it did arise after Christianity arose, we should expect some argument against what the Christians were claiming. We don't find that. The book of Daniel lays out a timeline that would culminate in the early 30s CE with the coming of the Messiah figure, of the same Messiah figure. This would establish the expectation of the Messiah coming right around the 30s CE. Since no Messiah actually did come, they started hallucinating about one, Peter, Paul, and others possibly. There were actually a multitude of different groups that were mining the book of Daniel in order to figure out when the Messiah was supposed to come. And so there's actually a wide varying amount of dates. It's just that the one that eventually turned into Christianity prophesied that it was supposed to come right there around the turn of the century. So, if it's true that there was a diverse set of Jewish beliefs in the 1st century and more than one group had ideas about this savior figure, then we should expect to find multiple different messiahs arising around the same time. And we find exactly that. These savior figures went by many names, including Messiah, Son of Man, the Righteous One, and the Elect or Chosen One. The Jews, including Paul and Philo, were reading the scriptures and pulling out different ideas about this Messiah figure, the Pesher creation. We know Paul was doing this because he references the scriptures for his information about Jesus, and we previously discussed how Philo was also doing this. One of the Messiah interpretations was this conquering military Messiah. We know this because of Josephus describing the Egyptian Messiah who approached Jerusalem with his army from the Mount of Olives, as the scriptures have foretold, but was defeated. It is very plausible that the failure of a historically existing Messiah, specifically this militarily conquering Messiah, to deliver on this victory, swayed the Jews to a more spiritual or celestial Messiah interpretations that had already won this eternal victory and provided the salvation that God had been promising since the scriptures. The scriptures are easily interpreted in this fashion, making this conclusion plausible. Most likely, Paul considered this death and resurrection to have happened in the firmament or the lower heavens. The Ascension of Isaiah is a 1st century Christian work that explicitly states that this is what happened. The Ascension of Isaiah was later redacted to include sort of this small pocket gospel that places the events on earth. However, the earliest redaction of this document did not include this portion. This doesn't prove the mythicist hypothesis, of course. It just proves that Christianity or Christians would be accepting of this idea, considering they did eventually develop this idea in addition to Philo's concept of Moses. Jesus' death and resurrection in the celestial realm of the firmament would also match what was being taught in other pagan religions at the time, like the Isis and Osiris cults. In that cult, there were public-facing stories that placed Osiris on earth, much like the Gospels, doing all of the things that he was doing, but in the secret inner teachings placed Osiris in outer space or the heavens. This is the basic structure of a mystery cult, which, if it didn't start as a mystery cult, it definitely developed into one by the time Paul adopted the faith. So at this point, we have some Jews in the Jewish community that were expecting a suffering, disgraced, and dying Christ figure named Jesus who would resurrect from the dead and absolve mankind for all of their sin. This is the great Redeemer described throughout the Jewish scriptures. All right, so mystery cults were a fad in the Mediterranean. Mystery cults are identified as any Hellenistic cult where individual salvation was gained through a ritualized initiation into a set of mysteries. You would then receive eternal life due to the sacrifice of a savior that experienced a passion where they defeated death. These cults were manufactured through the syncretization of Hellenistic and pagan ideas with local religions and cults. Thus, every mystery cult is different from every other because it makes the local culture's ideas it takes the local culture's ideas and merges them with those common features, altering and filling them out in their own way. The evidence of influence is in those common features. The evidence of syncretism is in the new or different features, or the new or different ways those features are realized or imagined. There were several savior figures popular at this time: Isis and Osiris, Zoroaster, Mithras, Adonis, Attis, and Dionysus, just to name a few. These mystery religions, like the Isis and Osiris cult, as revealed by Plutarch's record of the cult, thought their savior's death and resurrection only ever occurred in the celestial realm. Public stories placed this savior on earth, but the private teachings revealed it all happened in the celestial realm. Paul identifies key Christian doctrines as, quote, mysteries. That would be 1 Corinthians 2:7, 1 Corinthians 4:1, 1 Corinthians 13:2, 1 Corinthians 14:2, 1 Corinthians 15:51, Romans 11:25 through 26, and Romans 16:25 through 26. Mark's Jesus states that public stories are told to outsiders, while the true meaning of the message remains only for believers. There is a distinction made within the New Testament documents between mature and immature believers. Paul himself makes this distinction. Jesus was the sacrificial Savior who is the Son of God that experiences a passion, which he then dies, but defeats death and attains eternal salvation for his followers who are initiated into the religion. This is the exact structure of a mystery cult. Any hypothesis about Christian origins must consider not only what background information I've mentioned, but much, much more. Okay, so we're about to head into the Pauline evidence, but are there any questions about the background evidence that I've covered so far?
Yes, we did have two questions come in.
Mhm.
Okay.
So one was, would, I don't know how to pronounce this name, Melchizedek be included as one of the messiahs?
I'm not sure about Melchizedek. That hasn't come up when I've been reading stuff. But I know that there were a lot of Jewish ideas about who the Messiah was. There were a couple of figures in Jewish history that the Jews, like in the first century BCE time frame, they identified somebody as being a Messiah, and that's when the dying and rising Messiah in Judaism was actually first entertained, or it was first maybe not created, but it was first mentioned by people. And so that was in order to explain why somebody figured as a Messiah would actually died. They had to figure out how that could comport with their particular theology, and so they came up with this dying and rising Messiah motif in Judaism, but that again mirrors the pagan religions, the mystery cults that were in the area. So I'm not sure about Melchizedek. Could be, but I'm not sure.
Okay, Helen, you want to take the next one? It's like a three-parter, I think.
Yeah, sure. So the next one is what happened to the Essenes?
Essenes?
Essenes. I'm going to pronounce things wrong.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's the first part. Does Logos angel come from the Old Testament or some other book? And what might Paul associate Jesus with Logos? Why might he associate Jesus? Paul might associate Jesus with Logos.
Yeah, those are all really great questions. I'm not sure what happened to the Essenes. The Essenes seem to possibly have actually been the sect that diverged and became Christians later. At least they probably diverged and became a group of Christians. I don't know if that particular group survived or anything like that, but it's figured by some people that they could have been the first group of Christians that came about, the Essenes, in the Jewish belief landscape there. What was the second question?
So the second question was, at the scroll back up, does Logos Angel come, Candace, move your booty. Does Logos Angel come from the Old Testament or some other book?
So the Logos was a syncretization of pagan and Jewish beliefs. So the Logos that Philo constructs isn't exactly found in the Old Testament. What happened with the Logos is that the Logos is a product of Pesher creation. That's when they take segments of the Old Testament, like it can get down to literal single verses, as we see in Philo when he's talking about the Logos. They take these sections of verses that they then reinterpret to be about the Messiah. And so basically what Philo is doing is he's trying to reconcile these Hellenistic ideas that he is engrossed in his area, in Alexandria, and he's trying to figure out how they can mesh with the Jewish religion, therefore transforming the Jewish religion to keep up with the progressive changes that are being seen in the pagan religions. Because at this time, it was a pretty big race, amongst the religions to gain followers and everything like that. Like if your religion doesn't have any followers, then it's a dead religion, and nobody's going to follow it. And it was very important for people to stay kind of with the times. And we don't really see the like the strict traditionalists that we have like in Christianity, although you could probably make a solid argument that the Orthodox Jews were kind of that. But as you see, that doesn't stop the progressive change in religions. I think that's how religions actually stay pretty active and alive. But obviously Orthodox Judaism's still around, so I don't know, maybe that's a bad idea.
Well,
The
really,
third question was,
Why am
sorry.
I? Go ahead, Rob.
no, yeah. Why might Paul associate Jesus with Logos?
Okay, yeah, that was.
So there's actually not really good evidence to suggest that Paul knew anything that Philo was writing. So Paul didn't know about the Logos, but what Paul did know were the scriptures. And so basically what you have here is you have two individuals that are independent of one another that are reading the scriptures and eerily the same ways and producing figures that are eerily similar. They just have, the one is a more Jewish kind of version of the Messiah, while Paul obviously is figuring a more Christian version of it. And so what you have is just it independently coming about twice. And that seems to be the case because scholars have not been able to identify that there's any kind of causal link between Philo and Paul, like as if Paul was influenced by Philo. It kind of seems like there was an interpretation of the scriptures that included what would eventually create this archangel figure that Paul knew as Jesus Christ and Philo knew as the Logos.
So Dr. Ray posted about Melchizedek, pronounce it. And so he just some references for people that are going to be in internet land and not be able to see the chat later. In the New Testament, references to Melchizedek, I am so sorry, appear only in the epistle to the Hebrews, though these are extensive. Hebrews 5:6, 10, 6, 20, 7, 1, 10, 11, 15, 17, and 21. Jesus Christ is there identified as a priest forever in order of Melchizedek, quoting from Psalm 110, verse 4. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most of the things that are said about Jesus are ultimately tied to the scriptures. So, I mean, that doesn't surprise me. Like I said,
Yeah.
I hadn't researched Melchizedek specifically,
Right.
In the context of like origins of Christianity. So, sorry, I couldn't fully answer that question.
That's great. I just wanted to get that reference because that person asked, and I wasn't sure if when this goes up on the YouTube, somebody else might be wondering. So I thought I would add little nuggets of knowledge.
No, that's okay. Were there any other questions from anybody else?
Yeah,
Uh,
in fact, the next one you mentioned
yeah.
Orthodox Judaism. Someone said that they grew up ultra-ish Orthodox Jewish and learned that another one I'm going to botch the pronunciation. Elisha ben Abuyad, also known
Yeah.
as the other from the Talmud, went on to become Jesus. Is that rooted in anything?
I'm not too sure about that in the Talmud, which I do believe I have a section on the Talmud in the extra biblical references here. I'm not sure about that particular reference. The only reference in the Talmud that is about some kind of Jesus that a lot of people cite as being evidence that Jesus existed is this Jesus that actually existed under King Jannaeus, which is an interesting case because King Jannaeus was around the late first century BCE. And so it was about 100 years prior to the Jesus that supposedly started Christianity.
Okay, so there's one more question. Isn't there a consensus among historians that there was a man named Jesus who was an itinerant preacher around 1 CE, lived in Nazareth, had disciples, and was crucified by the Roman government?
Yeah, so this is a big question that normally gets brought up. Yes, the current New Testament scholarly consensus is that there was a Jesus that existed. What the minimal mythicism is doing is challenging the evidence that that statement is based on, or it's challenging the consensus. That's why in the preface to this, I described it as minimal mythicism takes on the burden of proof of challenging the consensus. So while the historians, the New Testament scholars rather, do agree that Jesus existed as a person, I feel like, and this is supported by the scholarship that I'm going to be mentioning tonight, it's supported by a lot of evidence to suggest that conclusion is wrong. And so while most New Testament scholars do agree about it, I think that they're wrong about it. And when we actually look at the evidence, we'll see how much of a shaky foundation that it's actually built off of.
Okay, so that's a good place to go back into the presentation. There are other questions, but we can get to those a little bit later, so you can continue on. So, but I see your questions, everybody. We'll get to them, I promise.
Yep. All right. So next, we're going to tackle the actual strongest evidence that there exists for a historical Jesus, and that's going to be the Pauline evidence, which some people might contest because the Pauline evidence is part of the New Testament, but you have to understand that like the New Testament has like documents from Paul that discusses Christian theology, and then there are the fictional stories that are the Gospels. And so we're not talking about those. We are talking about the actual letters from a person that identifies himself as Paul. And these are from the letters where we know that the same person wrote all letters who identified himself as Paul. So, Paul was a diaspora Jew who was writing around the 50s CE. That's when he started writing. And he was merging his Jewish ideas with pagan philosophy, literature, and mystery cults, exactly as Philo had done. Paul, as well as Philo, wrote in Greek, which was only taught in pagan schools, and thus would make it highly unlikely that Paul and his theology wouldn't be influenced by pagan traditions. It's not that Paul copied and pasted stuff from pagan traditions, but this concept of the Messiah was influenced by these popular pagan traditions that he had learned in the pagan school he attended. This influence is part of syncretism. Paul's Christ figure was only ever experienced through visions or hallucinations and by reading the scriptures. Galatians 1:11 through 16, Romans 10:14 to 17, 1 Corinthians 9:1, 1 Corinthians 15:3 through 15, and Romans 16:25 through 26. If we look at Galatians 1:11 through 16, we read this. For I would have you know, brothers and sisters, in some Bible versions, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I received it from, But for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. Additionally, the Pauline Creed has Paul claiming that he only knows of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus via the scriptures. Paul ends up describing the Jesus of Christianity exactly as Philo describes his Jesus archangel. They were both the firstborn son of God, Romans 8:29, the image of God, 2 Corinthians 4:4, God's agent of creation, 1 Corinthians 10:1-4, and a pre-existent being, Philemon 2:6-8, 1 Corinthians 10:1-4. Hebrews, while not written by Paul, but at the same time as Paul and potentially in a community influenced or actually Paul's community, describes Jesus as God's high priest and the supreme angel of all angels, which is in Hebrews 1:8. It's incredibly and highly unlikely that Paul and Philo would have independently come up with the same Christ figure. We see both sets of these ideas, Paul's and Philo's, culminating together after the first century. Justin Martyr, in his first apology, calls Jesus the Logos and the firstborn Son of God, so the same theology existed throughout early Christianity. There are a few verses in Paul that could potentially reveal a historical Jesus, but I'm not convinced that they do. First up, we have James, quote, the brother of the Lord in Galatians 1:19, and then the brothers of the Lord is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 9:5. The word used here that Paul specifically chose to use for brother can mean either a blood relation or a fictive kinship. Which one does Paul mean here? Many could claim that the natural reading would indicate a blood relation, but this stands in stark contrast to how Paul uses the familial terms. Paul commonly uses fictive kinships to refer to other believers in Christ, as we saw in Galatians 1:11. He addresses the entire group of believers and calls them brothers and sisters. Paul refers to other Christians as being his brother, stating that this one instance, other than another that appears in Romans 9:5, or sorry, 1 Corinthians 9:5, means a blood relation is opposed to how Paul always refers to fellow Christians. Sounds like cherry picking to me. There's no good evidence, like in the actual Greek used in this passage. That would be Galatians 1:19 or the 9:5 reference to suggest that that this was a blood relation.
From my recollection, being raised Catholic, I think we were taught that not only was Mary a virgin during the conception of Jesus, but she remained a virgin her whole life. So then she couldn't have a brother. So they go,
Yeah, it's weird for that one specifically because the Catholic apologists now, what they argue is that Jesus was either a half brother or a cousin, or James, sorry, James was either a half brother or a cousin. So basically, I feel like they speculate and invent this idea that Joseph was actually married before Mary, had a child, and then he, wife died or whatever happened there, and then Joseph remarried to Mary, and Mary had Jesus, and therefore half brother named James. That's generally how the Catholic apologists will argue for that particular one. But I feel like the actual Greek that Paul specifically chose to use there kind of rules out a blood relation, at least not with more information.
So I have a follow-up question to that. And I could be wrong about this. It's only through secondhand knowledge that I've heard about this. But if Jesus had other siblings that were claimed to be, like full-blooded siblings, not like half siblings. So is that something that you've come across in your readings? Because like I said, like, this is secondhand, so I might be
Right.
mistaken about this.
Well, so the only place where that actually occurs is in the Gospels.
Okay.
And the reason why it occurs in the Gospels is because Jesus is trying to make a theological point. It first happens in Mark, and basically Jesus's point there is that your earthly family doesn't matter. He makes that particular statement like throughout all of the Gospels, that your earthly family no longer really matters. What really matters is being part of the family of God. And that's exactly what Paul emphasizes in his epistles, is that, through Jesus's death and resurrection, you gain access to this family of God and are therefore allowed to inherit heaven, just like Jesus inherits heaven. And so it would be completely antithetical to Paul's point if he were
Mhm.
to emphasize a blood relation there. But yeah, it only occurs in the Gospels.
Okay, that I thank you for the clarification. That's why I
Thank you.
asked. So yeah. Okay, sounds like a cult. So, anyway, let's keep going.
Okay. All right. So next up is Galatians 4:4. Galatians 4:4 talks about Jesus being born of a woman, but there are a few issues with this interpretation for a literal birth. For one, Paul uses a different word here when he refers to literal human births. In this section, he uses a word that is more used to indicate manufacture or creation. Another issue with Galatians 4:4 is that it is contained within an allegory. It doesn't make sense that Paul would be referring to a literal birth here. The more parsimonious reading of this section is that he thinks Jesus had a manufactured Davidic body meant as an allegory for being born into sin. That sinful body was then killed, and then a sinless body was resurrected. It's meant to teach about Jesus's sacrifice, how Jesus's sacrifice cures this state of being sinful. Later in Galatians, Paul literally says that it is an allegory and that these allegorical women he speaks of are Sarai and Hagar from Abraham's story arc. It makes no sense to suggest that Paul meant a literal birth here. Then there's 1 Thessalonians 2:13 through 16. It's about the Jews having killed Jesus and receiving God's wrath. For it is widely agreed by mainstream experts to be an interpolation. First, this would be the only time that Paul blames the Jews for the death of Jesus. Paul also never discusses God's wrath in the past tense. He only references it as a future event. You can see Romans 2:5, Romans 3:5 through 6, and Romans 4:15 for that. This section is also antithetical to Paul's theology concerning the Jews. Paul consistently proclaims that they will be saved, not destroyed. And you can see Romans 11:25 through 28 for that. The wrath that's spoken of in this section is most likely the destruction of the Jewish temple and the Jewish nation and temple in 70 AD. Paul died in the mid 60s, so he couldn't have been referring back to the destruction if he was dead before the destruction happened. Because of these reasons, Paul most likely never wrote it. This was a later addition made by anti-Semitic historicizing Christians, and these were not the words of Paul. Next is Galatians 3:1, saying that the Galatians saw that Jesus got crucified. The Greek here actually does not say that the Galatians saw Jesus crucified, nor could that be what Paul meant. Galatia is in Turkey, which is hundreds of miles from Jerusalem, and these Galatians are later converts, not early witnesses. The Greek actually says that they saw his crucifixion foretold in Scripture. There's no mention here of that crucifixion actually happening on earth. And then the Romans crucifying Jesus in 1 Corinthians 2:8. Paul supposedly says that the Romans crucified Jesus. The phrase princes of this world or rulers of this world, which would be archons of this aeon, is not used by Paul anywhere else to refer to earthly powers, Roman or otherwise. Rather, the phrase rulers of this world is an epithet used repeatedly in the later ascension of Isaiah to mean Satan and his sky demons, not Romans or any earthly powers. And the similarities between that text and this are fairly significant. The idea that the rulers or archons, as meaning demonic powers, was common in early Jewish and Christian thought. Paul himself calls Satan the god of this world, a very similar phrase that occurs in 2 Corinthians 4:4. Paul says that Paul says in Romans 13 that the earthly authorities only do God's will, but here he says that the rulers of this world aim only to thwart God's will. These are therefore not the same beings. Similarly, only the demonic powers knew or cared about thwarting God's plan to keep death in the world. Romans would have no interest in thwarting that aim. So the motives that Paul gives these powers cannot mean the Romans. So when Paul says the rulers of this world killed Jesus, we can't tell from that passage if he means archons of this aeon, as in the demons of the sky, or actual human rulers. It remains vague, like all of the other passages we've already covered. The motives he imputes to them match the motives of the demons Paul frequently speaks of as enemies of God, not the motives of any human authorities. Paul never says the Romans or Jews killed Jesus. Paul never refers to any human authorities this way, as archons of this aeon, rulers of this world, or anything of that nature. And abundant Jewish and Christian literature elsewhere uses that phrase and phrases like it to mean demons of the sky and not humans. And then there's the Last Supper, which is in 1 Corinthians 11:23-26. This is actually recounting the Lord's Supper, which is conflated with the Last Supper. It actually wasn't the Last Supper, as Paul never identifies anyone else as having eaten with Jesus, and the ultimate source of his information for this supper is from Revelation. Of course, Paul didn't eat with Jesus at all. Paul didn't know Jesus other than through revelation from Jesus. He could have received this information from previous Christians, but that would be antithetical to Paul's entire preaching and apostleship. He stakes his validity, like the validity of his apostleship, on the fact that he received revelation from Christ and didn't receive any information from any human person on earth. Even if he did receive this from someone on earth, he couldn't actually claim this without invalidating his apostleship. So the ultimate source for this information would be, I guess, a fever dream. These vague passages in Paul represent the best evidence we have for a historical Jesus. For a supposed historical figure, this is pretty poor evidence. So just to close up on the Pauline evidence, if Jesus had existed on earth, why would they need to infer information about him from the scriptures? Why couldn't they just refer to what Jesus said or did? Why was it so important to Paul that he separated himself from any historical reference? He could have referenced disciples at some point, but he never indicates anyone as a disciple of Jesus, only apostles. Apostles were those that had a vision of this Messiah figure and had been revealed the truth through scriptures. In general, actual historical figures like Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and others have historical citations supporting their biographies and descriptions. They do not have vague prophecies that are interpreted to mean that they will come and do something in the future. All right, so we're about to go to the extra biblical evidence, but I was just curious if there were any questions so far on the Pauline evidence.
We have a bunch of them. You want to read one, Helen?
Sure. Let's see. Okay, taking from the pig part, is Jesus almost like Odin to come down and check on his creation and walk among them? So we're gonna go back a little bit.
Right. So as far as how Jesus is viewed by by Paul. It's not like Odin, becoming corporeal and visiting people. It's more like God sent Jesus as his representative in order to accomplish something specific, and then immediately go back up into heaven. And so that's more along the lines of it. So it's a little bit different. Interestingly, though, I believe it was Justin Martyr in the 2nd century that actually compares the things that are said about Jesus to the sons of Zeus, which, closely related to the Greek pantheon. But sons of, or wait, is that Roman? I get the Roman and the Greek pantheon mixed up at times.
Which god?
Zeus.
Zeus is the Greek.
Great.
Zeus is Greek.
Zeus is
The
Greek.
ones with the planet names are the Romans.
Right.
Venus,
Gotcha.
Jupiter. Yeah.
Yeah. Justin Martyr identified how Jesus is similar to the sons of Zeus. And so the early Christians actually knew that, well, these things that are claimed are the same things as all these other pagan religions. And, these other pagan religions, like the pantheon of the Roman and Greek gods, they would regularly come down to earth, similar to how Odin would, I guess. But it was really no big deal for this whole idea of them coming down to earth and everything like that. But obviously, Paul didn't, at least in my view, didn't see Jesus as coming to earth. He just came to the firmament, where he was then killed by Satan and his demons. And when he resurrected, he defeated death and was able to procure eternal life for people that believed in him and everything. So that's how I view that. But yeah, I feel like it's very similar ideas.
Okay. All right. You want to go, Rob?
I can do that.
Okay.
So we had one about, I don't know if this was a joke, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why was Jesus more important than the other 2 guys that were hanging next to him?
Well, so the things in the Gospels usually trace to 2 different things. It's either theological purposes, or it's something that's mentioned in the Old Testament. I believe Jesus hanging on the cross with criminals is something that the Old Testament foretells about Jesus, so that's why it had to happen. And then the gospel authors also use that particular situation in order to emphasize certain theological concepts, like, the concept that, no sin is too big to be forgiven, and as long as you believe in Jesus, you go to heaven. Right? That's one pretty big concept that is exposed right there. And then there are other things that are more scripturally based, like these things had to happen because the scriptures say that they have to happen. And so that's why the gospel authors wrote it in there, like Jesus being mocked by the people on the crosses with him. That's another thing that I believe is foretold in the scriptures.
By the way, isn't the other people being crucified with him in not all of the Gospels?
I know that they're heavily emphasized in some of them, but I can't remember all of the Gospels and if there's criminals hanging around him.
Okay, so this is your task, people who are watching this and have access to Google right now. Put it in the chat. See what it says.
Okay, so one more question about Paul, and then we'll move on. Was there so as far as in Paul's time, was there things that could have caused his hallucinations, like fasting or using substances as part of the religion that he would have,
Mushrooms,
altered mind
mushrooms.
experiences? Yeah.
Well, I mean, fasting has been known to like induce hallucinations and everything like that. And there's a lot of religious practices that could induce those things, including using hallucinogenics and everything. I lean more towards this idea that Paul could have been a schizotypal individual, just simply meaning that he was prone to hallucinations. And oftentimes what we find in those types of individuals is that they can hallucinate auditorily or visually if like they have some kind of internal conflict or anxiety over something. So maybe Paul was persecuting the Christians, but it starts weighing on him pretty heavy. And so, to compensate, his mind sort of hallucinates these things. But this was also happening to other people at the time. Another thing to consider here is the fact that we have modern studies that show that these types of individuals often gravitate to religious cults, because these religious cults are very accepting of those kinds of individuals because they feel like they are getting like messages from God. And that was the general idea of it. Like mental illness at this point in time was not seen in the same way that we see mental illness. And so like if you were hallucinating voices or you were hallucinating visually, it was seen as messages directly from the God at a lot of times. And so they wouldn't have considered him crazy. They would have considered him special, like, touched by God or something, like he was a special person. And we don't really need a lot of people to do this in order for Christianity to arise. As we see, we've got Paul that was doing it, and Paul identifies Peter, the Apostle James, and an Apostle John in Galatians 2, as all being apostles. And Paul explains that apostles are, those that have received revelation of Jesus and been given information directly from Jesus. And so all of those people supposedly received those hallucinations. So that's a small amount of people amongst, the group of Christians that definitely did exist. So, yeah, we only need a small portion of it, which seems to match with how many people in the wider population now tend to be, these schizotypal individuals.
Well, and also
Okay.
too, like there could be an encouragement for these people to take hallucinogens, even as something as like ergot poisoning or, any sort of hallucinogenic plants that they have access to, because, and schizotypal people that have auditory or visual hallucinations, it exacerbates it, and that could be seen as a way for them to even continue have more intense spiritual experiences, where they don't know that, like you said, we didn't know how mental illness and certain substances affected the brain back then. So that's another possibility as well. So just to get add a little bit more thinking, something to think about, about that sort of subject. In the chat, somebody said, I only see it mentioned in 2 gospels, the criminals, that is Matthew and Luke. So,
Okay.
so only in 2 gospels so far. So thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't remember which gospels that they appeared in, but it varied, just like with the empty tomb.
Yeah.
It varies depending on the gospel.
It varies. How could that be if this is the word of God? I don't understand.
These were
I don't
eyewitness
understand.
accounts, y'all.
I don't understand. All right. One more question before we go on to your next section.
Sure.
Let's see. Was there ever a time when a sect of Christianity may have had more mystery teachings for the initiated, mature believer, which made Jesus into more of a celestial being like these other cults?
That's a definite possibility. Like I was saying in Mark, these later earthly stories that were constructed, it talks about how these things were separated out. So in the parallel cults that existed at the time, the Isis and Osiris cult, we see this exact structure: public stories or earthly based stories that were meant to, and I guess, appeal to people. But when you get fully initiated, you get revealed the true stories, which have all of his operating in the celestial realm, in the heavens. And we even see Paul distinguishing between initiated and uninitiated believers, and calling them like mature and immature. And so the immature believers would believe in public stories about Jesus, like the public earthly stories about Jesus, while the mature believers would believe in the secret teachings, which we don't have now. So we don't know exactly what those were. But all that means is that you can't rule out a celestial version of the stories, or at least understanding, like an understanding that places all of this as happening in the heavens, sort of like, you have to buy in first in order to get revealed that it's all a con kind of thing.
Okay, so we have a possible correction in the chat. Other people were Googling the question, and it seems now they were mentioned elsewhere differently, of course. Like Mark, others crucified with him and mocked him. Matthew 2 were crucified with him and mocked him. Luke 1 mocked him, and the other asked for to be remembered. So I don't know that we have a firm answer on that. You know, Helen, I'd love an RfRx episode where somebody goes through the four Gospels, you know, the sections that are supposed to be the same, and we point out all the differences in the four. Because like when I went to church and they just read one gospel section, and you don't
Mhm.
remember a week later when they're going to read another gospel that says something different. That would be fascinating, I think. I don't know. Put it in the chat if you think that
I
we've
think
had
I might know
some-
people that could do that.
Cool.
So,
All right, so time to go on to the next section, Helen. What do you
yeah,
think?
let's go on to the next section.
All right. Well, the next section is the extra biblical evidence. So, the most popular source to mention is Josephus. There are two references in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. The first reference is the Testimonium Flavianum. Eusebius's version is the only version we know to exist. All other versions are based on Eusebius's copy. Like the Arabic and Syriac versions, they are both traced back to Eusebius, as shown by Alice Wheely. Any claim that there was an earlier redacted version is an ad hoc presupposition. Typically, you don't have historians doing that. Ad hoc explanations make your argument a bit weaker. Paul Hopper has shown that Josephus did not write the Testimonium. In a narrative anomaly in Josephus, he establishes that the Testimonium Flavianum uses finite verbs differently than Josephus. The Testimonium uses oblique and passive language to insert Pilate into its story, which is contradictory to how Josephus does it when mentioning Pilate. The Testimonium has a completely different time organization than the surrounding passages. The Testimonium seems to be absent of any plot, which is completely different from the surrounding text. And the Testimonium would only make sense to Christians. G.J. Goldberg has established a link between the Testimonium and Luke's Emmaus Road story. There are 19 parallels between these two works. It's not just the fact that these parallels exist, but they exist in the same order in both works. This makes coincidence highly unlikely and dependence very likely. Ken Olson has established several parallels, both in language and content, between Eusebius's writing and the Testimonium. This coincides with the fact that the Testimonium seems to pop into existence right around the time of Eusebius. Louis Feldman has also concluded that a Christian like Eusebius is most likely the author. Phrases such as wise man and worker of amazing deeds and teacher of human beings and quote Christian tribe are used by Eusebius to describe Jesus and are unused by Josephus outside the Testimonium. Additionally, the Testimonium fails to explain what it means to be a Christian, which is uncharacteristic of Josephus, considering he does it for all the other sects that he mentions. Finally, as stated before, the Testimonium seems to pop into existence between the 3rd and 4th centuries. Origen had ample reason to mention this passage in Josephus because Origen regularly quoted Josephus. No other pagan or Christian scholar seems to even know this passage in Josephus exists until Eusebius quotes it in the 4th century. Normally, just because someone doesn't talk about it doesn't mean it didn't exist, except where there's ample reason for these authors and historians to reference such a passage if it were to exist. This mountain of evidence directly points to the conclusion that either Eusebius or his predecessor, Pamphilus, so I don't know if I pronounced that right, inserted the Testimonium into Josephus's work using the Gospel of Luke's Emmaus Road story as a skeletal framework for the passage. Piling on top of all this, the Testimonium is out of place in Josephus's work. One common way you can test for interpolation is to take the interpolated text out of the work and see how the surrounding text flows together. If they flow seamlessly, it may have been interpolated. It's just an indication that it might have been. This is the case for the Testimonium. The preceding paragraph flows seamlessly into the paragraph after the testimonium, making it quite likely that the whole passage was inserted into Josephus's work where they thought Jesus would appear if Josephus had said anything. Simply put, Josephus definitely didn't write this part of his work, at least as it exists now, which is the only version of it that we actually have evidence for. The next reference is the James reference in Josephus. This is most likely an interpolation, as well as the important parts of this paragraph seem more like marginal notes than anything else. This is in stark contrast to the testimonium, which seems to be maliciously inserted completely. This seems to be more like a scribal interpolation where they took a reference note written in the margins, a marginal note, and interpolated it into the passage, thinking that it was supposed to be there. One reason to think this is that later on in the passage, we have a completely different Jesus being selected to replace the James that got killed. This Jesus was not introduced or explained, which is contrary to Josephian style. Another thing that casts doubt on this passage being completely genuine is the fact that it doesn't match how Christians understood James, his supposed brother, to be killed. The paragraph is confusing, and it only seems to become reasonable if you take the part referencing Christ out and replace it with some kind of reference to Ben Damnius, who that's Jesus Ben Damnius that appears later in the passage, making the James that appears earlier in the passage related to the Jesus that's selected to replace him. This seems to be the most parsimonious explanation for what is in our current extant copies of Josephus. Josephus clearly did not write anything about Jesus, even though he probably should have. Next up, we've got Tacitus. He was writing in the 2nd century about Nero and the burning of Rome that occurred in 64 CE. We would expect Christians to definitely exist in 64 CE. It is very plausible that the Christ referenced is interpolated. This passage is actually discussing Chrestus as referenced by Suetonius, and this has been forensically shown to be the case. They can tell that originally, the current extant text said Christus. But even if we grant that Tacitus originally made the reference to Christians and Christ, it only proves that Christians were in Rome in 64 CE. We totally expect this on minimal mythicism. Now, one thing that a lot of people like to say about this reference is that, oh, well, he just mistakenly misspelled Christ and Christians into Christus and Christians. That does happen, but only in what's called vulgar works. And it doesn't mean like they have potty mouths or anything. What that means is that they were very amateurish in their writing. So like you would have to argue that Tacitus, one of the best, Roman writers at that particular time, was prone to making simple mistakes that amateurs would make. And I don't think that actually works all that well with what we know about Tacitus and his writing. But anyways, so Tacitus most likely got his information from Pliny the Younger, considering that they communicated with each other on a regular basis about these types of topics. Pliny was interrogating Christians at the same time that Tacitus would have been writing about the burning of Rome. Simply put, Tacitus does not provide an independent reference to a Jesus Christ existing in the 1st century. At least that is the conclusion of New Testament scholar Robert Van Voorst in Jesus Outside the New Testament, where he agrees with R.T. France's conclusion on the reference. So this is not actually a mythicist argument. This is actually a mainstream New Testament scholar argument, just in general. And we have a lot of other common references, which if anybody wants to ask questions about, we can definitely go over more in depth. But Pliny the Younger, as we just mentioned, it was written in the 2nd century and interrogating Christians. So it just shows that in the 2nd century, this is what Christians believed. It's not an independent historical source, which is something I guess I didn't really cover, is that we're looking for independent historical sources. So basically, these sources can't be based on works prior to it unless it's like sourcing it. And even then, if they're sourcing it, their information to that, you would actually use that information, like that source, as your actual source and not the one that just regurgitates what that source was saying. So you really only have one source there. You don't have 2 to independent sources. So it would have, like, typically with independent sources, there, it's textual evidence, it's anecdotal, first person testimony or firsthand testimony, things of that nature. And we just simply can't identify any independent historical source for Jesus that's not that doesn't ultimately resolve back to Paul. Paul seems to be our only independent, sort of pseudo independent historical source that we have. Next is Lucian of Samosata. He was also writing in the 2nd or 3rd century and only vaguely references that some of what Christians believed. It's not an independent historical source. Suetonius, writing before in around or at least writing about the 50s, wrote about Chrestus, a Jewish instigator that made the Romans mad. He's not a historical source for Jesus either, because it's specifically Chrestus, which was an actual name as opposed to a title, which is what Christ is. Thallus is a is a piece of fourth hand information and doesn't even tie any of the events he mentions to Jesus or even the Palestine area, and it's not a reference at all. Marbar Serapion, also writing in the 2nd century and also only vaguely talking about what Christians believed. He's not a historical source. And again, this is not a mythicist argument against these sources that we've been talking about. You can review Robert Van Voorst's Jesus Outside the New Testament for more information about why these sources can't be established as independent sources of the historical Jesus. There are no references to this Jesus figure outside of the Bible that also don't depend on the Bible for its information. Now, to summarize my case. The 1st century Jews were using Pesher logic to interpret the scriptures to discover information about the Messiah. There were different Jewish sects that came to similar, if not the exact same, interpretations of scriptures concerning the Messiah of Judaism. These Jewish sects would have been allowed a reinterpretation of scripture in order to construct an image of the Messiah. We know there were multiple sects of Jews doing this because both Philo and Paul came to the same conclusions. Both Jews and Christians attest to a pre-existent Messiah figure that both groups identify as a Jesus, especially considering the prophetic nature of the name in the first place. Jesus has a very intimate relationship with Jehovah, Yeshua, and all that. It's very prophetically tied to this idea of a Messiah. Our only independent evidence that Jesus Christ comes from Paul. He never cites a historical source concerning Jesus and even explicitly separates himself from any historical sourcing. This is a major blow to the historical hypothesis because that means they have no evidence for an earthly Jesus. Finally, there are no external references to Jesus that aren't dependent on the Gospels or extant Christian belief. All of this combined with the popular mystery cult fad going around that emphasized suffering and dying saviors that procured an everlasting life for their followers, that was attained through a sacrifice, and their followers attained the same eternal life through baptism and communal meals. It makes the proposition that Jesus probably didn't exist at least likely, if not the most likely conclusion. All right, and so that was my presentation. I hope people enjoyed it, and now I'm ready for the onslaught of critical questions.
Well, we covered a lot of them. There's only a few left that we collected, but we will let people ask other questions as we go on.
Yeah, and I
Helen,
want to say,
what were the questions left there?
yeah, I just want to say thank you to all the people that contributed questions during the talk, because it actually added a little bit more flavor and nuance to it. So thank you very much. Okay, so there's poor evidence for historical Jesus. I'm not arguing that he existed, but can't we say the same? There's poor evidence for Robin Hood, King Arthur, Merlin, and others of so forth.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I feel like that's kind of my point.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, King Arthur, Robin Hood, Merlin, all of them, as far as we understand them to be, they're definitely mythical, like legendary. Now, could there be like historical figures behind it that inspired them, sure. With the Gospels, for instance, there's a couple of figures that could have inspired a number of events in the in the Gospels. So I mean, there's Jesus ben Ananias. He could have inspired the basic structure of like the passion and everything, like how it actually occurred, not the fact that it occurred, but how it occurred in the Gospels. His whole story could have been an inspiration for that. And there's a lot of different things that could have inspired the stories that constructed this Jesus of the Gospels. But I feel like you have to ask, like, is that really the Jesus that people believe in, whether now or back then? Or was it something a bit more divine and celestial in nature rather than on the ground, like real person kind of thing?
I think there's a amalgamation where the facts kind of get shrouded by the fiction, and it's hard to parse out where those ideas come from. And I think that, we see this a lot, like some mentioned, like we know that King Arthur's myth was probably inspired by a king, and they add supernatural elements to the story. And then over time, the myth takes over the actual idea of the person. So, and that's common, in a lot of stories of people that we have these. I mean, like, look at our own founding fathers. We have people believe the myth of them more than who they actually were as people, so
almost every
it just
time you
happens.
look into a historical figure, even in the
Yeah.
last 200 years in American history, as you
Yeah,
said, and you see the real story, it's nothing like what people believe or are taught.
right.
It's amazing.
So, and now we're talking about a man that lived 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
And when there was, no way like we have even 200 years ago of everyone was illiterate. I mean, it was just word of mouth stories changing over time. And like, how could one believe that that is in any way accurate? I don't know.
all right, Rob, go ahead.
I agree.
Yeah. So yeah, that was a pertinent question. What do apologists, or as Brian Keith Dalton has labeled them, excusagists, consider the best argument for historical Jesus?
Typically, what I've heard is some kind of appeal to the sources behind the Gospels. Obviously there's the string of apologists that will claim that that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts themselves. But the more critical scholars will actually bank on this idea of a Q, M, and L document that inform the Gospels. And even critical scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman, he says that those are independent accounts of Jesus, and they count as independent accounts. He also counts the Gospel of John as an independent account of Jesus, like in that John didn't have access to the synoptics or other documents by Christians, even though the Gospel of John was written in the 2nd century. So I'm not sure how he actually gets there with that, but these are all like the sources behind the Gospels are all hypothetical sources, which means that they don't actually exist. They're only hypothesized to have exist. And that was in order to reconcile the problems with how the Gospels sort of play off of each other. And they contain some of the same material, but then they also contain different material. And so the Q hypothesis, which is different from QAnon, obviously, the Q hypothesis, including the M and the L documents, those are all like, oh, well, these things would have to be in the Q document in order for it to make sense for the rest of the Gospels. And so they basically, what I feel is cherry pick information to put into this Q document that would suffice, their issues with the synoptics and the Gospel John. That seems to be the only reason why they exist. And Mark Goodacre has actually a really good case against Q even existing in the first place. And so I follow more along with Mark Goodacre's analysis of it. It seems a lot more parsimonious and a lot simpler to just say that Mark was written first, and then Matthew copied off of Mark, and then Luke copied off of both Mark and Matthew, and then the Gospel of John had access to all three of them. And so that's how all of that is explained. I feel like that's a lot simpler of an explanation than inventing multiple different sources that we can't actually prove exists.
And it was
So,
also still a terrible game of telephone because
Yeah.
they contradict each other.
so speaking of that, one of our questions directly mentions the Q document. Were the writings of Paul before or after the four Gospels or the theorized Q document?
So the Q document is regularly placed like alongside Mark. So Mark wasn't said to have used a Q document. The Q document was something that supposedly existed either right before Mark or alongside Mark, depending on who you talk to. And so Paul was independent of the Q document. And so, like, for instance, Dr. Bart Ehrman would include Paul as an independent source, the Q as an independent source, M as an independent source, L as an independent source, and whatever sources inform John an independent source. So that's how is generally argued.
Okay. As someone said in the chat, people mention Q, and all I can think of is Q from Star Trek. So sorry.
So, what is the word Fisher? Fisher?
Pesherim.
Yeah. What does that mean?
So Pesher's and Pesherim creation was just basically Jews. It was a process that Jews used to re-examine the Old Testament or the scriptures, the Septuagint, in order to illuminate information about their present the present things that they were going through or near future things that they knew were going to happen. And so it was basically just a way of reinterpreting their own scriptures because the way that they interpreted them didn't pan out, and so they have to try to understand them in different ways. And we see the exact same thing going on with like apocalypticism now. There's that guy, I can't remember his name, but he's always got a new date for the apocalypse. And it was 92, 97, something about Terminator 2 Judgment Day. I they keep
August 29th,
reconfiguring
1997.
that's it.
Oh, we're still here. Skynet did not take over.
Right.
I had that on my calendar that year, and I was like getting worried and worried as we get approached it.
Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
I was just going to say they keep, it was just a way for them to reconfigure their interpretations so that it better explains their current situation or what they should expect in the future.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask, how do you spell Fisher?
Pesher?
Pesher, yeah.
Pesherim, maybe Pesherim.
Okay, all right. And then I'm gonna ask one more question, and then we're gonna wrap up and then go to the hangout. Okay, are you familiar with the Jesus Mysteries? Was the original Jesus a pagan god by Timothy Freck and Peter Gandy?
Yeah, that one has a lot of issues with it, and it's well, modern more mythicist leaning scholars like Carrier, Raphael Taster, others of that particular area of New Testament studies. They recognize the problems of freaking Gandy. And so that would be a this is I'm glad somebody brought this up because this is a representation of bad mythicism or bad historical research into the origins of Christianity versus like well-sourced and well-researched ones, because there is a quite a big distinction, because prior to on the historicity of Jesus by Carrier, what you had was a field like of the internet, wherever, that was filled with like crazy mythicist ideas. Some of them even exist, to this day, and is upheld by a lot of people as being more likely than minimal mythicism. But all of these ideas are not well researched. They're not sourced in anything. They have a lot of ad hoc speculation. And I don't know, I can't remember right off the top of my head the specific things in freaking Gandy that were bad, but I feel like I remember it reminded me a lot of the Zeitgeist movie, which was
Yeah.
particularly horrible. And I regularly have to correct people like, please don't share this image. It's a bad image to share because it's wrong.
I remember I watched that movie and I was going through a deconstruction of like my spiritual woo-woo place, and I was like, this is really bad. Like, so it was one of those movies that were like, when I was going through that letting go of that type of stuff, that I was like, oh no, no.
I got a
Um,
heads up about how bad that movie was, so I never
yeah,
watched
don't.
it.
It's kind of like
Yeah.
What the Bleed Do You Know. Don't watch that either. That's
Oh yeah,
terrible.
that one also. Yeah, I've heard of that one.
So now let me introduce our wonderful founder, Dr. Daryl Ray, where we're gonna by the way, I want to remind everybody we have a fundraiser coming up on May the 4th on the line, where Dr. Ray was on with Matt Delahanty a few days ago. I know it's good. So he's going to talk a little bit about that and some other things that are going through his brain. So hi, Dr. Ray.
Hey, Helen. John, thank you so much. This has been an area of fascination for me for like 20 years and probably longer. I went through a course in college called the Synoptic Gospels when I was a junior. I had no idea what the Synoptic Gospels were until I took that course, and I had studied the Bible my whole life up to that point.
So what does that
That
mean,
opened
Dr. Ray, for people who aren't familiar with the term?
Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the Synoptic Gospels. John is so damn crazy different that they don't include that. So the three appear to be related to each other. They use a lot of the same stories and imagery and stuff like that. So that's what the Synoptic Gospels
Thank
are.
you.
And John mentioned synoptics a couple of times. Anyway, that's when I got started thinking about, well, this is kind of weird, but I didn't give it a lot more thought until early 2000s. And I've been an out atheist. It's not like I think I'm too crazy or anything yet. And then I read Earl Doherty. Do you know Earl Doherty? I read his stuff and I thought, I have never heard this before. It was probably 2002 or three, and I'm starting to think there's a whole way of looking at the Gospels I've never even considered since I first went through that course. And so I started reading all of his stuff and actually started corresponding with him. And to some degree, that influenced a little bit how I wrote the God Virus. I mean, and I told Earl that you kind of gave me some ideas for what I was writing in the God Virus. Anyway, I don't know if you know this, John, but David Fitzgerald's got a new book coming out. Actually, 3 new books coming out. And I read the manuscripts a month or so ago, and wow, they are mind-boggling. But they look at mythicism even in a bigger picture, like not only did Jesus may or may not have existed, but did Zoroaster actually exist, or did Buddha actually exist, or did Muhammad actually exist? And there's just so many questions that we just assume are being answered, and they aren't. And they fall into the same category as Robin Hood, or King Arthur in many ways. So anyway, just interesting. For all of you interested in this topic, look for David Fitzgerald's book coming
He's
out.
going
I
to
think
be
it
on
comes.
April 15th.
Oh, good. Well, I think his book comes out early May. I can't remember, but yeah, I'm looking forward to that. You're going to find that book. Well, those books. One book he split up into 3 because it's like 900 pages long if you put it all in one. Anyway, several of you asked questions about the Essenes, and John talked about it, but there was a lot of those kinds of cults popping up everywhere, just like today. Think how many cults are popping up every year in the United States alone. And then you add India, or you add other countries, cults are always popping up, and that's what was going on in the first century of the Roman world, was cults popping up everywhere. By the way, a woman gave me this book. It's called Following Philo, John. I don't know if you've heard of the book. I tried reading it, but I never finished it, so I don't even know if it's any good or not. But she has some of the same ideas about Philo that you just talked about, and I hadn't thought about that in several years. And a couple other pieces I just want to highlight about what John said. The schizotypal personality actually has been fairly well documented across the board in various cultures and in various cults as someone that many cults kind of put a spotlight on as a spiritual leader. This puts it in very simplistic terms, but schizotypal people aren't fully schizophrenic, but it appears that the underlying genetics, it's kind of like the genetics are like half schizophrenic instead of fully on schizophrenia, it's schizotypal. And they still have the ability to have visions, but they're still socially acceptable. And if you look at some of the literature of Native Americans and shaman in Mexico or other kinds of spiritual leaders, you'll find they fit this mental class category, if you will, very, very well. And I think Moses, if he did exist, Jesus, if he existed, Muhammad, if he existed, a lot of these appear to be schizotypal. And if you want to know more about that, do a little Google search, you can find all about it. I first heard about this from Robert Sapolsky because he had observed this in an African culture that he was close to while he was studying baboons in Africa many years ago. Anyway, just some of my comments, John. Always fun to have you here. This was fascinating. I think people really liked hearing it. I think it may have challenged some people's ideas about what we do or don't know, historically speaking.